Welcome to Behavior and Risk, where we explore the intersection of decisions, the brain, uncertainty, and the business world. I'm John Burkhart.
And I'm Rich Loria.
We're glad you took a chance on us today.
Charlie Javis is an ambitious entrepreneur. She's the daughter of a successful hedge fund manager who has enjoyed a comfortable childhood of horseback riding, private schooling, and graduating from one of the world's finest universities at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton Business School with a degree in law and finance. She has started multiple businesses that ultimately have failed, but again, that happens with many entrepreneurs as they try to find their footing before landing on Frank, a hybrid FinTech EdTech firm offering students assistance in navigating the Byzantine process of applying for financial aid. Frank had legs. Begun in 2017, its goal is to provide assistance to hundreds of thousands of students, and by 2019 had received millions in investor backing from many prominent investment firms, including Apollo, Aleph, Chegg, Reach, and Gingerbread Capital. So this led to a marriage led by investment banking firm LionTree between Chase and Javis and her Frank team in the summer of 2021, with an agreement being reached by Chase to purchase Frank for $175 million. In addition, Javis and many of her employees would be brought into Chase as either managing directors or holding other high-level positions within the firm. For Chase, this deal represented a golden opportunity to jump into the EdTech space and, in addition, cross-market products and services to the coveted Gen Z and youth marketplace where Chase found they were underrepresented in terms of their client base, and also where customer lifetime value can be huge. However, by the following year, the deal turned sour when a review of Frank's user claims of roughly 4 million users were tested in an email campaign. Out of 400,000 emails that were sent out, only 28% actually reached destinations, meaning the other 72% bounced back. And out of these 28%, only 1% were actually opened, and only 103 were actually clicked through. These findings ultimately led Chase to firing Javis and her staff and beginning legal proceedings against Javis and others, with Javis and her partner Amar countersuing the bank. Chase ultimately reported the fraud to the SEC, who then brought a civil complaint against Javis, while also getting the Justice Department involved, with the attorney of the Southern District of New York beginning a criminal investigation. This ultimately led to a 5-week court case in early 2025 that led to Javis being convicted for defrauding Chase.
I've noticed going back over our previous episodes, I have a tendency to say, this is a really interesting one, a lot. In fact, I tend to say that for most every episode that we've done. In some ways, this is not surprising. I hope that we're not bringing forward cases that are uninteresting. But with this particular case, with Javis and Frank and JP Morgan Chase, I really, really mean it when I say this is a really interesting case. There is a surprising amount of very granular factual paper trail around this in terms of what happened when, what data points were available to whom, what did those data points say. I don't want to go too deep into that because honestly, there's so much available that we could easily spend 20, 30 minutes just going over the factual issues around the case. And that's not where the interesting stuff sits. Instead, let's say that to my eye, this is clearly a case where Javis behaved in a fraudulent manner. that there was clear misrepresentation of what the consumer base was on the Frank side. And this was done specifically to drive up sale value in the eyes of any sort of purchasing entity, in this case, JP Morgan Chase. This is not a case of buyer's remorse. This is not a case where, after acquiring the product, Chase looked around and said, "Oh, you know what? This really doesn't align very well with our interests. Maybe we should try to recover something by making a lawsuit of it." They were clearly misled. But this then leads to a very interesting question of how did they botch this so badly? As you pointed out, Rich, the degree of misrepresentation between what the presented and advertised consumer and use rates were relative to the actual consumer base that Frank had coming in were radically different. There was due diligence conducted. There was at least a month of due diligence conducted by JP Morgan Chase with third-party firms participating. How did they get this so wrong? And then on top of that, I think there's an additional interesting question, which has less to do with business decision making and more, I think, about how businesses don't always behave in quite the rational, institutional fashion that we often think they do, which is, while it sounds horrible, $175 million sale value that, was artificially inflated. And for you and I, $175 million is a whole lot of money. Well, at least for me, it is. I don't know much about your personal finances. I don't want to judge. I'm not asking. But for you and I, that's a whole lot of money. For JP Morgan Chase, that's a drop in the bucket. That's a rounding error. They could easily have swept this under the rug and absorbed it. In fact, there's even a quote by, who is it? Jamie Dimon. I'm not sure how his last name is pronounced, where he says, "When you're getting up to bat 300 times a year, you'll have errors." They could easily have written this off as an error. Why do they choose to get so aggressive in pursuing criminal charges and essentially admitting to bad decision making? There's a lot to unpack here, and I think there are all manner of behavioral issues at play. But I think the primary one, and I'm going to just tee this up and then shut up because I've been rambling a bit here. I think the primary one is something that you and I have talked about a lot. And in fact, it's the very first thing you and I ever talked about on this podcast, episode 1 of Behavior and Risk. This is perhaps the most clear-cut and beautiful illustration of deal lust that I've ever seen.
Yes, John, this is definitely an example of deal lust. And going back to your earlier point, just to drive home that this really is a drop in the bucket for Chase, guess how much Chase made in 2024?
2024?
Yes.
It's on the order of 177 billion. I know that in 2021, when they made this deal, their annual revenue was 121.7 billion.
Right. So if you do the math on that, it doesn't even show up in basis points.
Under 1%.
Under 1% of 1% is how minuscule this is. So you are absolutely right that in ordinary circumstances, this would be a write-off that would largely go out in the rounding of what they reported to investors. So the fact that this is so high profile, or it has been made so high profile deliberately by the bank, does beg some questions. And I think some of this just comes down to some of the things here were obvious and could have been checked very readily within the 4 weeks that they did due diligence. And while the opening that I went through talked about the data, and we should definitely talk about why they didn't do more analysis of the data, because they had opportunities to, and I don't think it would have been a lot more work to do further diligence of what was being provided by Frank. I want to touch on something else that in some ways is more concerning for me when I looked at this case, which is the history of Charlie Javis. Her history of inflating claims, her history of having run-ins with authorities, including the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Education. The fact that her product effectively purported to be part of FAFSA, which is a key part of the financial aid applications. So her product was designed to help navigate it. It was never endorsed by the Department of Education or any other government agency. And the fact that the government actually went after her in this regard and settled a trademark lawsuit with her speaks volumes about her own integrity or lack thereof. And the fact that she was granted this halo without even doing a little bit of this back checking, it wouldn't have taken much for Chase to do this, is a bit astonishing.
I'm going to offer a yes and that may even be more of a yes but in response to that. I agree with everything that you just said, that her track record charitably raises questions, that she had multiple endeavors that did not succeed, that she had lots and lots of backing from venture capital and from angel investors, and yet nevertheless was seeking a very, very large buyout, that she had been under investigation, in fact, reached a settlement with federal regulators. But we see a recurring pattern. I'm not sure why. I can speculate across many businesses where when certain bad actors are called out or caught, oftentimes they land several years later in more mainstream or reputable organizations. We talked about this in our discussion of Silicon Valley Bank, where the former, I want to say, chief risk officer of Lehman Brothers was actually part of the executive board at Silicon Valley Bank. I have to wonder if there's some part of business leaders, especially those who've come up through the trenches and who have run startups themselves, who look askance at government regulation. And when someone is caught doing something inappropriate by government authorities, is there some level of "atta girl" that's attributed to that? I don't know. It's speculation. But I think if that is true, it plays into a broader thing, which is, I think, the representativeness around her. On paper, superficially, Javis looks like everything that you would want a successful founder and fintech leader to be. She plays fast and loose. She exists beyond the scope of where current regulation has laid out guide rails. She went to Wharton for grad school. She has funding from Eisenberg. There was interest from Capital One as well as Chase in this. She had had multiple startups in the past. She checked every box in terms of this is what a successful founder looks like. And so I'm not sure how much real weight her track record counted against her. Should it have? Absolutely. But did it? I don't know. I think that's an open question.
Yeah, I think that those are good points. That there's a saying in sports, right? If you're not trying to cheat, then you're not trying to do your best. And that's a bit cynical. I'm not saying that every professional athlete out there is doing something untoward, but I'll just put it this way. There is something to be said about pushing the boundaries and finding your edge. And that if you're not trying to do that, you're not doing the most to be successful. And if that means you're playing a little bit loose and fast with facts, that's okay. Somehow it's okay in that realm. Not everybody's going to tie down every fact. There's not going to be a fact check on everything that's being said or claimed. So if you want to stretch things a little bit, that's okay. The question becomes, when does it cross a certain line? And clearly Chase here is making a statement in terms of that this clearly crossed the line for them, and that in some sense they felt violated and taken advantage of by someone who deliberately tried to defraud them of tens of millions of dollars.
Absolutely. Yeah. You and I both exist in the small business space. And within this domain, I think there's a implicit understanding that some level of creativity in how you present certain things is acceptable and even expected in marketing. But when it comes to negotiations and compliance, it's no longer allowed to be on the table. And I think that's what happened here is there's kind of an understanding that, yeah, we know you're exaggerating some things, but don't do it to us. And I think calling this case exaggerating is generous. This is not exaggerating. This is overt misrepresentation. And it clearly was done to JP Morgan Chase. And they're not happy about it. They're very unhappy about it.
Yes, and I think it's the fact that it was being done directly at them, and it was also the degree. The degree is important here, and also the means that were being used. The fact that under investigation, it came out that Javis hired data scientists to meticulously create plausible names and accounts that could pass a preliminary smell test speaks volumes for her intentions. She had no intention of being above board. She was going to find some way to corroborate every claim that she could make.
And I think that a great deal of both their anger over this being done to them and the question of how did they miss it is explained by the same thing, which is what I would call a form of category error, in that I think that JP Morgan Chase, based on what we have available, and this is all in public domain, they were thinking about the acquisition in the wrong way. In our initial conversations, long before we started recording this podcast, Rich, you and I wondered amongst ourselves, why was JP Morgan Chase so upset about this when they had a functioning product? We've checked this, we validated it. Frank works. Frank, as a platform, does what it is advertised to do. It does facilitate completion of the FAFSA, the Federal Application for Student Aid, which, if you've never completed one, is genuinely a nightmare to complete. And simplifying that is a very valid product. That is something that when I was applying to undergrad, I would have cheerfully paid $20 a month for, which was the original revenue model. So given that they have this working product and then they have their own consumer base, which is sizable. When I say their own, I mean Chase's own consumer base, which is sizable. And they have their own marketing and outreach divisions, which are also formidable. Why were they so angry about being misled about this? And I think it goes down to something that was kind of buried in a lot of the quotes that honestly I didn't even catch until my third or fourth read through, which was that the bank believed those young future college graduates could potentially be sold on the idea of a lifelong partnership with the financial institution. They were not looking at this as a revenue generator. They were looking at this as a lifetime client generator. They were looking at this in terms of like, okay, yes, we'll get $20, $30 a month for the Frank product, but this person is also going to finance their car loan through us, and they're going to finance their home loan through us. And it's a reasonable expectation because, as we've talked about in a number of domains, easiness and inertia carry people to make a lot of different choices. If I can do everything through my own financial portal in one screen or one platform, I'm absolutely going to do it. If another provider is a bit more expensive or a bit more convenient, it's not enough to get me to separate it out. So I think I got distracted by the numbers around Frank itself and not the value proposition that Chase was seeing, which was, okay, we've got 4 million potential clients. If we can convert a third of them, that's, 1.5 million lifetime users. That's billions of dollars of revenue. And when I think about it that way, now their anger starts to make some sense. Now I start getting a better sense of why they feel so deceived and so betrayed and so injured. And I also see why they may have been inclined to sort of look past some quirkiness in the due diligence because the pot that they were seeing was just so juicy.
And again, that gets back to the degree of how they were misled. I think if the numbers have been maybe 10% off, 15% off, I think there would have been a little bit of eyebrow raising, but I think they would have moved on because they still would have had a large base to work from. And you're absolutely right. And this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about customer lifetime value. For folks like myself, I'm approaching 60. My customer lifetime value is not nearly as much at this point as potentially somebody who's in their early 20s and just starting out, who's got so many things to look forward to. Someone who's going to be making significant purchases and building up a nest egg over time and acquiring all sorts of assets. These all represent great opportunities for an institution like Chase. And For an institution like Chase, this can be a bit of a challenge because they're still seen very much as an old-fashioned brick and mortar type of institution and may be struggling. And I sense from the narrative are probably having a little bit of trouble finding ways to access Gen Z and younger customers. So this was a great opportunity for them to jumpstart it. It really fit a number of strategic imperatives they were looking to satisfy, a great way to show growth. I mean, not like a boatload of growth, but certainly growth and the potential for much more for years to come in ways that they're not doing through their traditional channels.
Their judgment, though, in how they calculate all this led them to make the wrong decision here, though. I think that one of the things we have to recognize is that they created a false equivalence because they could potentially in the future have 1.5 million lifetime customers spinning off of their Frank product. They basically had in their head that buying Frank meant they would get 1.5 million customers. And you can draw a line to it. You can draw a strategy that shows here is how we get from this initial purchase to 15 years from now, a $1 billion increase in revenue. But it's not a done deal. Making that purchase does not automatically mean that this increase in customer base and increase in revenue is going to happen. And this basically leads to a sense of endowment. They are assuming that this value is already theirs, that it is theirs to hold. They are self-reinforcing. They're imagining a positive future outcome, and they're getting the dopamine hit from it right away. And this is causing them to make decisions and make judgments that they really shouldn't be making. And then I think this gets amplified even further by something that we haven't really talked about in depth. I made a passing comment on it, which was that around the same time that due diligence was being conducted, Capital One was sniffing around Frank as well. Capital One conducted their own due diligence around Frank for acquisition. And I don't know what it was. This an open bid? Was this a competitive process? But regardless, I would be shocked if even in a so-called private or nominally secret basis, Chase was not aware that Capital One was interested or involved. And I mean, if you were Javis, shame on you if you're not trying to use differential interest from different parties to drive up the purchase value. That fear of missing out, you've already endowed to this future bump in consumer base. And now there's a sense that somebody else might come and snap it up from underneath you. Makes it that much easier to hand wave away any discrepancies that you see and say, yeah, you know what? No, if we don't get this, then they will. And we're going to be doubly behind. So it just amplifies this poor decision making that objectively you can look back at and say, this was a bad decision. You can look back and say, if this data were available to me in the moment, this would be a bad decision. But the behavioral factors and the influences around their judgments, I think, made it very easy to land on this problematic conclusion.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things I'd like to just expand upon. John, those are all fantastic points. Both the deal itself and the lawsuits that came out of it were driven by loss aversion. Loss aversion was a key behavioral driver. You pointed to FOMO. That's an example of loss aversion. It goes on all the time, particularly in this space, and it is a major behavioral driver of deal lust. So there could be somebody else who could snatch up this great opportunity to add 1.5 million or whatever the number is you want to put out there of young customers who are going to be around for a long time. Really drove some lack of discipline in the whole process. So one of the things I didn't mention in the open is that the data was originally requested during due diligence, and it took 3 weeks for Frank to be able to comply with that request. That would certainly raise at least a yellow flag, if not a red flag, that, why is it taking you so long? If you've made this claim, that data should, if it's not at your fingertips, be something that you should turn around. Because if you're contemplating being part of a firm, you're going to want to provide support for your case and do it in a timely manner. So that certainly would raise a yellow flag, but I think that fear of missing out the fact that not only Capital One, but also Bank of America was purportedly sniffing around as well, I think led to a certain rationalization of, okay, we got the data now. We want to just get this deal closed. Let's not do too much digging into it. Are there 4 million records? Good, check. We'll figure it out later. Let's just get the deal signed. Let's get the people on board. And then let's start to work on our various cross-marketing strategies. I think what happened then is as they started to try to deploy said cross-marketing strategies, the reality of, oh my God, there's not nearly as many customers here as we thought, led to another sense of loss aversion, a sense of, oh my God, we didn't get what we thought we bought, and led to that whole dopamine hit you talked about went to zero. And now you had thinking of, oh my God, we've been taken, we've been embarrassed, and therefore taking significant action against these folks.
I think it's even more pernicious than that. There was definitely rationalization, but on top of that, there was, I believe, another process going on. We've talked about confirmation bias in many episodes before, that the tendency for people to seek out evidence that supports the conclusions that they want to land on or what they already believe. But there's a second element to confirmation bias that's often ignored or glossed over, which is we also tend to ignore contradictory evidence when there is a conclusion that we want to land on. And that has to have occurred here. When you have such a juicy pot at the end of the tunnel where, well, that's an interesting mixed metaphor, such a bright light at the end of the tunnel or such a juicy pot on the stove, there are all manner of reasons to say, you know what? We're not going to worry about that. Exactly as you said, it's rationalization, but it's even deeper than that. It's a built-in bias where our brain is telling us that's not important. Don't worry about that. And I have to think that becomes even more problematic when you do realize that you've been taken and the information was right there in front of you. It makes you feel, well, stupid. And I don't say that with any judgment or with any sort of malice because you and I, every person listening to this podcast has experienced that before. You see something that you should have been aware of after the fact, and you just feel kind of dumb. Well, we don't like feeling dumb. And I say this not you and I mean, yes, I like feeling smart because I need to believe that I'm the smartest person in any room. But as a species, as humans, we don't like feeling dumb. And being taken is something that we feel as an insult to our personal agency. Somebody is taking away our ability to have free will in this world. We don't respond well to that. And we tend to lash out when people attempt to limit our own agency. So that explains, I think, a great deal, maybe not all, but some of why Chase was so aggressive in going after Javis publicly when it really could be written off as just cost of doing business and drawing a lot of public attention to problematic due diligence.
Yeah, I think that's right, John. I think this all points to a sense of vulnerability that we all feel, that we don't have control over everything. There's so many stimuli coming at us, so many different forms of information to process. And sometimes it can be challenging in the moment to figure out what are the important data points and what are the ones that we can ignore. And that feeling of vulnerability leads to a certain sense of fear and taps into our survival instinct. And as I've talked about in a number of issues of Zen Actuary, our need for survival is not just life or death. That's the most obvious one, but it goes to the whole egoic structure. And as you pointed out, if you have the need or if you've built a self story that you're the smartest person in the room, you're going to do whatever you can to try to support that story because having something that contradicts that story can be really jarring and lead to its own sense of loss aversion being triggered. And that is something that people will go to great lengths to not feel.
So I want to just offer a quick clarification here. I realize as you were speaking that you and I are talking back and forth and we're on video and we can see each other and we're muting and we're laughing as the other person's talking. I don't actually feel a need to be the smartest person in any given room. That was a statement of sarcasm. Please don't interpret that as excessive ego on my part. That was realizing that, wow, these subtle statements don't always necessarily work in pure audio format. But yes, these hits hurt. They hurt us in a personal way, even though they are business decisions, because ultimately, until we get to a point where AIs are acting as CEOs and CFOs, people are going to be making business judgments. And we can have robust processes, but ultimately, people have to make the decisions and act on them. And these behavioral biases and personal biases and cognitive effects are going to influence that.
I was just going to add, John, about loss aversion. I'm making it sound as if loss aversion is a bad thing and that we should all avoid loss aversion in how we behave, particularly when it comes to merger and acquisition strategy. Nothing could be further from the truth. Loss aversion exists because it has helped human beings survive for millennia. Again, as we've talked about in prior episodes, it's not about the behavior itself. It's about perhaps a lack of awareness and a lack of fundamental understanding at what a particular behavior may be causing us to do. And that if we can just take certain moments to pause, in the case of making a critical decision on an acquisition, maybe taking a little bit more time or doing a little bit more digging into certain facts, those are things that can help, that can actually be driven by loss aversion, because none of us wants to get taken on a deal to try to avoid a significant loss. So loss aversion has two sides of the coin here. When used appropriately, it can lead to better decision making. It's when we are being driven by loss aversion to do things that, when using our calculation and more of our rational thinking processes, we wouldn't do, that we start to get into some trouble. That's really what I'm trying to say for everybody out there on this podcast.
That's, I think, a subtle but very important distinction and qualifier there. Yeah, one of the things that you and I teach in the cognitive bias and risk management class is when do we want to use loss aversion as our primary choice architecture, and when do we want to use more traditional economic practice? And I usually revert to expected utility theory to drive decision making. You're absolutely correct. Loss aversion is very, very good for ensuring continued survival, for making sure that we are going to be around tomorrow to be able to make another decision. One of the things that is interesting to sort of think on and parse out is that, barring an implosion on the scale of Enron, which, okay, is not completely outside the realm of possibility, JP Morgan Chase is going to be around next year. And they're going to be around in 5 years, and they're going to be around in 10 years. Could their business go up and down? Yes, absolutely. Could they have novel exposures to risk? Could they have a changing regulatory landscape? Not only could they will. But they have sufficient size and scale and assets that they're going to be around in 10 years. So they really are in a place where, rather than survival, their decision making should be driven by optimization, by that expected utility theory architecture, because they are facing recurring and iterative decisions, and they really don't have to worry, is this decision going to bankrupt us tomorrow or next month? So I'm thinking on this in terms of the due diligence, then honestly, an expected utility calculation probably would have been, or some very modified, I'm not saying pure, probability times outcome equals value, but some variation of that, a corrected version of expected utility calculation, really would have been the appropriate way to evaluate this transaction. Now, that, of course, presupposes that you have good information about what your probabilities are, which means that you're assuming that Javis and Frank are giving you accurate information. But if you are committed to using that as a decision-making architecture, it means that you're going to be that much more conscientious about running your own evaluation. In this case, you had the third party investigators who were looking at numbers as well. And one of the things I thought was really interesting was that I forget the name of the organization. I'm not going to take the time to dig through it, but one of the third party diligence agencies only checked whether or not the customer fields were populated. They did not check whether or not they were valid. And they didn't even claim to report that they were valid. They simply said, yes, we saw 4 million entries. If you're committed to using an expected utility architecture, which for most large enterprises is more often the correct one, you're going to be very diligent about saying, okay, let's find out what those numbers really are. And so this all goes back to your point, I think, about slowing down and recognizing, because that is one of our points we come back to for every shape of cognitive bias, which is don't make the snap decision. Stop, take the time to think it through, and figure out what the actual underlying reality is.
And John, I think that goes both ways because the easiest thing to do, and I can tell you this from my role as an actuary for over 30 years, the easiest thing to do, especially when you're in a risk management position like that, is to say no. I would say, regardless of one's view, take a step back. You may come to a different conclusion, or you may come to the same conclusion. But the point is to take a moment and stop and not be rushed into anything. So the one thing that we don't know, and it's not clear from any of the paper trail that I've seen, is what were the status of those negotiations? What kinds of messaging was going on? How were different bidders being presented in these negotiations? Because clearly there's always some back and forth about, oh yeah, we have a meeting with Capital One or a meeting with Bank of America or who else. The real challenge when you're in that situation is to not let that noise get to you. It's easier said than done. I want to be very clear about that. But I also, again, want to just reiterate that it's not about stopping the deal lust and that train from going forward. Sometimes it's also about taking a step back if you're on the other side of the fence and saying, okay, what may be here that I'm not seeing? What opportunity may I be missing? And I do want to give Chase some credit for being thoughtful about this. I don't think what they were going for here was such a bad idea. I don't think the business rationale, although unproven, which was one of the reasons Capital One didn't go forward. That's one of the interesting things about this whole case. I don't think the business rationale is one way or the other. One can create a relatively plausible story if the data is there and the business model exists as it was portrayed.
Yeah, I was just going to say something, I think, tangential or adjacent to that, which is that for all the red flags and problems and misrepresentation that occurred here, this is a recoverable position. Yes, do they take a financial hit in the short term? Absolutely. But they still have ownership of the Frank platform. They don't have the user base that they necessarily wanted, but the product itself is real and it exists. And I was thinking on something as you were talking about your experience in the risk management space. I was thinking on a quote that you shared with me multiple times, which is, we're not paid to say no. That when you do have a risk management function, your job is not to say no all the time, because that's not risk management. That's just being a speed bump or a roadblock. Your job is to figure out what are the risks, the upsides and downsides here, and is the juice worth the squeeze, basically. And through that framework, I think that what probably should have been done, and perhaps it was, I don't know, we're not privy to the minutia of how the due diligence was conducted, but what should have been done was probably a credible worst case scenario analysis of, okay, here are the numbers as presented to us. Worst case, what if they're wrong? What is our business position then? And I mean, one, I think that's an important lesson for any due diligence. I think that doing a credible worst case scenario analysis for any transactions under evaluation should be just de facto. That should just always happen no matter what. And two, that then gives you a business strategy in case bad things happen. In this case, I would argue that the long term value of Frank is not changed. I think that how much revenue and how much consumer base they can acquire from this is not in any way meaningfully affected. The timeline is affected. Instead of having these, and I've been saying 1.5 million, that's just been I can't even say back of the napkin calculation. That's been a wag of about 1/3 of the presented user numbers. Let's just continue using that as our number. The 1.5 million long-term customers isn't going to happen in 10 years. Maybe now it's 20 years. Long term, the strategy around Frank should be unchanged. Of course, coming back to those behavioral biases, this is a problem because of intertemporal discounting. Now the timeline is extended far, far out. And even though the objective numbers of potential consumers and the objective value of how much they would be paying is exactly the same, because it's happening on a further timeline, it's not perceived as being as valuable. And so it's a curious case. I think that this is something where, well, I don't know what Chase's long-term strategy is. It remains to be seen. As you pointed out in your introduction, the criminal claim was just settled, 2 months ago? So who knows where they're going to go with this. But ultimately, my own feeling, without being wired into Chase decision-making or financials, is that they really shouldn't change their position with Frank in any way, because all the value is still there. There's just more work to be done.
Those are good points, John. They may not have come to the conclusion that this was worth 175 million. I mean, I think you bring up an interesting point about, okay, now you have this data. What do you think this is really worth? Which, again, maybe you think it's worth nothing. Maybe you write off the 175 million. I don't know what they've actually done accounting wise from that standpoint. I'm sure that much of that 175 million was goodwill. So maybe they've already written it all off. But if you really do have a viable product, and that product, maybe it doesn't have a whole lot of value in and of itself, but if you still believe in the whole idea of setting up this platform, making life easier for young people to get financial aid, and then working off that to offer them other Chase products and services for years to come, then you're right. It's just going to take longer to get to the numbers that made this so attractive in the first place. And that's why I think this is more about what you touched on and the prospect of endowment and the feeling of already having that value and not having to put in the additional work. I think if you're really taking a step back and thinking about this strategically, you're going to do exactly what you said, John, and just do a version 2.0, perhaps when the dust settles. And I think maybe that's what's going on right now, is they're working through the legal system, through the justice system. I would imagine if they really believed in the thesis that drove this transaction, that they'll go and take the product, they still own it, and they'll just begin working from it. I think they're just in a legal position. They probably can't do that yet.
So then, in terms of general lessons that we can take away from this, I think one of the things that I'm most curious about, and I have my own thoughts, but I'd like to get yours as well, is how do we make due diligence better? There were two major failures here, of course. There is the fraudulence of Javis, which there's very little that as risk managers we can do directly to mitigate, but the due diligence itself was also problematic. How do we make due diligence better so that these kinds of mistakes are not made?
Wow, that's a really difficult question, John.
And I mean, that's probably a 2-semester class in and of itself.
It's definitely at least one semester. I think some things that can be done, again, are things we've already touched upon, which is be really clear in your business rationale, then have multiple scenarios. You need to have a transaction model. That model should be flexible. It shouldn't boil the ocean, but it should be able to answer some very important questions about what can go wrong and what happens if it does go wrong. And I would even go a little bit further beyond the scenario planning. I would say do some tabletop testing. What happens if the scenario plays out? How do you react? How do you try to minimize the loss or try to preserve as much of the value that's going into your purchase price?
And that ties directly to what I was going to say, and I think is just restating what you said, which is don't just do a credible worst case scenario analysis during due diligence, but use that to generate a plan. If it gets to the point in due diligence where it looks likely that it is going to move forward, whatever the shape of the transaction is, use that worst case scenario as a roadmap of what then? What happens if things go wrong? Because we know the transaction will not work out the same way that we hope it will. Hopefully, it won't go as bad as your worst case scenario, but it's not going to be as golden and seamless as we always want it to be. I would also raise the point that coming back to this false equivalence, make sure you understand exactly what the business outcome of the transaction is. In the case here, they were thinking about a business outcome of acquisition of 1.5 million new lifetime customers. That wasn't actually what they were buying. They were buying a FAFSA product that had a list of email addresses. Now, you can make a business roadmap from one of those to the other, but that doesn't mean they were buying 1.5 million customers. And this false equivalence, a sort of failure of the isolation effect that Kahneman and Tversky have described, can lead you to make some really inappropriate conclusions.
Yes, and that gets into one of the big issues in terms of M&A, in that there's what you buy and then there are synergies. One of the things that we talk about in our book, John, in chapter 14, is the difference between revenue and cost synergies. Most transactions include some type of synergies. And by that, I mean that when you do the acquisition, the fact that you have a different buyer allows for additional activities or additional types of actions that the new management can take that increase the value over what it is under its current ownership. And the two types of synergies that you hear about all the time in the M&A space are revenue synergies and cost synergies. In my experience, cost synergies are not 100%, but are much more reliable from a probability standpoint. So the expected value of a cost synergy you build in has much more weight to it, not 100%, but certainly much more weight than a revenue synergy, because it is hard to generate revenue. As small business owners, we know that, John, that it's difficult to get revenue. It's definitely the case. And certainly when revenue synergies are postulated, they really do have to be taken in many cases with a grain of salt.
One of the things we always advocate is cynicism in evaluating any sort of information. And I think this is perhaps a cynical interpretation, but also an important one. If someone is offering to sell you revenue, think about that real carefully, because if it genuinely is straight up revenue, why are they selling it? It's not to say it's impossible. It's not to say it's off the table, but definitely give that particular transaction a bit more attention. Whenever we talk about synergies, I'm always tempted to make some sort of comment about the intersection of sins and energy, but I think that might be for a different topic. But it does lead me to my next point that I wanted to bring up, which is we mentioned that in due diligence, there's vetting of the numbers that you can, and then there's the implicit assumption that the numbers are being offered in good faith. And you can't do a whole lot to make somebody provide good faith numbers. If they want to be fraudulent, if they want to misrepresent, there's very little that we can do on this side of the transaction to affect that. We can't change what they're going to do. How can we help reduce the probabilities of getting taken? How do we help insulate ourselves from the bad actions of other people?
Yeah, this is a tough one. And we also talk about this to some extent in our book, even though I could probably do 2 lectures on valuation and some of the challenges in doing appropriate valuations. The truth is, most valuations I've seen done by necessity start with information provided by the seller. And the seller, understandably, with self-interest bias, is going to want to paint things in as much of a light as they can. And as we've talked about in other podcasts, John, once you put numbers out there, you get into one of our favorite behavioral effects, which is anchoring. And one of the biggest things that I'll just put out there for everybody is you've got to really watch the anchoring effect. Chances are when you start to kick the tires on the numbers, you won't adjust them accordingly enough in a direction that probably needs to be adjusted in. It's very, very challenging just because this is what we tend to do. And anchoring is another thing that we have done for millennia. It is something that has been inherited. So the best thing I can say about that is when you're building the model, try to build as many of your own assumptions in as you can, and to some degree, as much as you can, limit what you need, but you can't eliminate all data. You're not going to build your own model completely from scratch and create your own data. You're going to need some type of supporting data from the other side.
To that point, I would say when you're doing that due diligence, don't so much kick the tires as poke holes in the tires with the assumption that you're going to have to replace them. Even if somebody is coming to the table in good faith, their own interest is going to be, as you pointed out, to present as optimistic and charitable a picture of their own entity as they possibly can. Their interest is in driving the sale value up as high as they can. Unless we're talking about maybe somebody who is getting out on short notice and they desperately need money, or you have somebody who is phenomenally charitably minded in a way that the business world has never seen, people are going to want to maximize sale value. That's just basic economics. That's just good business. And if you have a publicly traded company, you have a fiduciary obligation to maximize sale value. Poke holes in the numbers. Of course, they're going to have numbers that don't match up with what you think they should be. So this goes back to our broad prescription for any sort of cognitive bias, which is cynicism, which is refutation of the null hypothesis. Look at any sort of judgment with the assumption that there is something wrong with the conclusion. Figure out why the conclusion is wrong. Maybe it's not. But if it is, now you can make a much better decision about what should this actually be worth. And I need to emphasize, this is equally applicable to both good and bad actors. This advice is relevant whether we're dealing with somebody like Javis, whether we're dealing with an unapologetic sociopath, or whether we're dealing with somebody who is your best friend and wants to hand over their organization to you for a small bit of profit to pocket. All of these types of individuals merit this kind of cynical evaluation, assuming that their numbers are wrong. Now, yes, to your point, Rich, unless you want to do 6 months of due diligence that costs seven figures, you're not going to be able to generate all of the numbers from the ground up on your own. You're going to have to take some of theirs, but make sure that the numbers add up. And if they don't add up, that then tells you, where do I start devoting efforts to actually getting real self-generated data?
Yeah, and I think on that point, John, make sure to differentiate validated data that has come from audited systems versus data that either hasn't been audited yet or is a pure projection. Those are two very different things, and each should be adjusted accordingly. I would haircut anything that hasn't been validated.
This whole case really is a giant object lesson in a number of things, but most specifically deal lust. I know that's what really grabbed both of our attentions when this was first put in front of us. And in many ways, it offers an object lesson in what not to do when you have an offer before you that seems too good to be true. In this case, Frank and Charlie Javis's company really was too good to be true. Red flags were there. Indicators said that there are problems with what is being put forward. And there were, in fact, other organizations that backed out because they decided that there is too much that just doesn't add up here. Nevertheless, JP Morgan Chase went ahead with this particular acquisition and now seem to be kicking themselves and, as much as they can, kicking Charlie Javis over this outcome. Deal lust is normal, or maybe not normal, but in many ways a natural happening that we do need to guard against in every particular evaluation and M&A assessment that we conduct. A solid overlay of risk management onto M&A evaluations is crucial to make sure that we at least minimize the probability of these things going wrong. The federal application for student aid is a nightmarish jungle, and the business landscape is a jungle as well. And you owe it to yourself to take the amount of time and exert the appropriate level of effort to make sure you make the best decision you possibly can. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time. Behavior and Risk is brought to you by Capita Solutions. Behavior and Risk staff includes our research team, Sherry Xu and Jin Zhang, and our editing team, Qingying Gao and Athena Liu. Theme music by Crypt of Insomnia. The opinions presented here are solely those of John Burkhart and Rich Loria and do not represent those of Columbia University, Capita Solutions, or any other organization. We thank you for taking a chance on us today.